Good evening and welcome to this brief conversation, to this evening of conversation around ideas. Let me at the outset say that after having been through the book, I think it's a moment for rejoicing, for celebration, because what Govind has managed to do very painstakingly with this book is put together an attempt at an intellectual history, an attempt at piecing together a history of ideas kind of approach to a figure we've all heard of and know in some form or the other. And because he's so familiar, because we know about him, we also tend to forget about him a little bit, right? So that ambiguity he's been able to tease out and flesh out into a work of what I'm calling intellectual history. We live in a time when the idea of doing things such as a history of ideas or an intellectual history is seen with suspicion, right? And it's very important that the attempt be made, that the conversation be broached, right? And that is one of the reasons why I see this book as a moment that is worthy of celebration. The manner in which the book is written, right, the close attention to sources, the manner in which the ideas and the analysis of Vivekananda's ideas is carried out is something that I would probably have no hesitation in recommending to my own students as a good example of how to do research and how to do research in an interesting fashion, right? That's another reason why I enjoyed reading the book, and I hope I'm able to transmit some of the pleasure and some of the things I've gained from reading the book over this evening's conversation. What awaits the reader of this book? There are many things. You get to look at Vivekananda, the man, you get to look at his ideas, you get to look at the influence his ideas have had, you get to look at the key moments that Vivekananda is part of. You also get to know a bunch of other things simply because Govind is a very careful tracker of information. So one of the things you learn, for instance, and this is the quizzer in me speaking, one of the things I was very kicked to find out about while reading the book is how the turban that you associate with Vivekananda came to be part of the get-up. It has something to do with a very warm friendship that he had with a princeling, and it comes from there, apparently. That's one little jhalak, one little moment from the book that I thought I'd share with you. Now, all of us have a moment where you become aware of Vivekananda, you become aware of this figure, and there's usually a kind of intermediary, somebody who says, this is someone you should know about, this is someone you should read, or this is someone you should make the acquaintance of because you'll go from being the useless person you are to someone slightly better, right? There's some such moment that each one of us will be able to recall. I'll impose upon you a small moment of that sort of interaction as a way of leading up to a question. For me, like for most young fellows in the 70s and the 80s, Vivekananda was a poster. You saw him in people's houses, you saw him with an estimable quotation attached to the poster, and you saw him in the screen has gone away, but there's a folded hands and turban Vivekananda that you generally get to see. And that's what he was for a long time, till a cousin from back home, my father's village, came visiting. He had no English, he only spoke Tamil and had been educated in Tamil medium. But he told me the story once while we were doing nothing of any great importance. He told me the story of Vivekananda getting onto a ship and going to Chicago and speaking to these American fellows, and how when he said brothers and sisters of America, they all stood up and applauded because no one had spoken to them like that. I was about 7 or 8 when I heard this story, and it was a story that was strangely thrilling. I still don't quite understand why I found that moment thrilling. I don't know if you come across that moment, and I don't know what your reaction to that moment was. I've still been thinking about it. A few years later, in an English textbook, we had a lesson on Swami Vivekananda, and two moments I remember from that English textbook lesson. One was his conversation with Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, the famous conversation about, have you seen God, right? And Ramakrishna's answer, which disarmed Vivekananda. The second moment was the world religions moment, and my cousin's account had been very accurate because it was exactly as I remembered him telling me the story. And once again, I felt that strange thrill coursing through my spine as I thought of this young man going to a strange country and talking to a group of 3,000 or 4,000 people and moving them by his very first words on that occasion, right? As I continued into life, I encountered the Ramakrishna mission. They used to be very active with schools in Bangalore in the 80s, and they used to have a competition, a speaking competition that high school students were supposed to take part in, and I found myself being collared one day by the headmistress of my school and sent to this competition. And so then I had to speak about this man who till then was a poster and a story. And I went and read up a little bit about him. Luckily in those days, even though we didn't have the internet and all that, everybody's house would have some 3 things written by Swami Vivekananda. So I visited 2 or 3 neighbors' houses and I had enough reading material. And out of that, I cobbled together some 3-minute speech, but lots of things that I came across in that moment of frantic research still stay with me. One of them being this very characteristic Vivekananda comment where he said, young people need Vedanta, but they also need football, just as much as they need Vedanta. So there's a certain spirit, right? A certain irrepressible spirit, a certain mode of, shall we say, irreverence or energy or whatever you want to call it, that stays with me from those moments, right? And as I look back on this moment of acquaintance with Vivekananda and and the ways in which we encountered him, right? It brings me to this question that I want to ask Govind, right? And that is this question about what his own moment of acquaintance with Vivekananda is. Where did it begin and how did it become this book?
Hi. So my own moment of acquaintance with Vivekananda was slightly idiosyncratic in that I had heard of him in school, but I did not pay much attention to this figure. I was more interested in reading novels. But when I entered college, I used to live in a joint family, and we used to keep, even when we moved out, we used to keep staying for long times at my grandparents' house. So an uncle of mine who was for some reason shifting or something, he had the complete works of Swami Vivekananda and that very cheap paperback edition that the Ramakrishna Mission brings out. And he had left them there for good. And I picked it up and started reading it. And this was my first encounter with a philosopher. I mean, I had not read any kind of philosophy before. And it was quite a revelation, Vivekananda's thinking. And I remember interestingly that at this time, I was also started reading Nietzsche. And in a sense, both were, at least for a young man of that age, both were a trip in opposite directions, but also similar because both these thinkers negate or say that everything that you have known up to this point is not true. So though intellectually poles apart, the emotional experience was quite similar. And how did I come to write this book? When I trace back the origins of this book far back enough, I think it might probably have started with a Facebook fight. This was 10 years back at least, when I was younger and apparently considerably less wise, because I used to get into this heated political arguments on Facebook, much to the amusement of my friends. And what happened in this case was that a Facebook acquaintance had put up a poster of Vivekananda with half a dozen curated quotations. And then he went on to claim that these quotations showed that Vivekananda was a Brahminical Hindu supremacist and also a sexist and a casteist to boot. So he hadn't read Vivekananda, and I tried to engage in a conversation with him, which quickly became belligerent on both sides. And I think it ended with him telling me to go and build a temple for Vivekananda. I haven't built a temple, but I did end up writing this book about him, which I don't think either of us would have foreseen at that point. The reason I mentioned this particular incident is that I think that was the first time I encountered and I became aware of the fact that a lot of people who think of themselves as progressives, leftists, liberals, they have a rather negative view of Vivekananda, which interestingly in many ways runs almost parallel to the kind of claims about Vivekananda that the Sangh Parivar makes. And the only difference is that what is seen as vice by the progressives would be seen as virtue by the Sangh Parivar. And another cause on this journey to writing this book was another book on Vivekananda that came out a few years back, and which looked into the modernization of Hinduism by Vivekananda, which is a very interesting topic. So I remember picking it up. But as I went through it, I realized that the book was a complete hack job, which was claiming that Vivekananda was the founding father of political Hindutva. So I decided to write a rebuttal of these arguments and wrote it for the magazine I worked for them. It was, so you are trying to argue against an entire book, so the article was almost 10,000 words long, and so this forced me to do some research. I revisited the Vivekananda Ramakrishna corpus and became more familiar with it. And as the anxiety in this country that most of our public institutions are being captured by Hindu majoritarianism, as it kept increasing, at one point I felt that one of the things to be done, and there are many things to be done, but one of the things to be done is to take back the narrative on Vivekananda. Because Vivekananda's thought is a very powerful resource to use against any kind of religious identity-based politics, but particularly so against Hindu majoritarianism, because he is speaking from within that tradition. So that is how I came to pick up this project.
Fascinating. It must be the most productive outcome to come from a Facebook fight. They usually end in counting how many likes or how many friends you lost and things like that. I'll come back to this point you're making about rereading Vivekananda in a moment. One of the things that I've always been very curious about, and it's a curiosity that was both quenched and also reignited in some form by the first part of your book, was this Congress of World Religions moment, right? So when the story first arrived, it was a thrilling story, but as I grew older, I began to look at that story with great skepticism, right? Did it really happen? Why would 4,000 Americans rise to their feet and give a standing ovation to a man who uttered 4 simple words: brothers and sisters of America. What was so great about what he said, right? That moment of skepticism has been one that survived. And I like the fact that this moment of, that your book does something to speak to this moment of skepticism. One of the things that I gathered from reading your book was that there's something of what Walter Benjamin would call a dialectic moment, right? A dialectic image, rather, about this moment, because the Vivekananda who steps up to speak is a person without credentials in any sense that we recognize credentials, right? He's a man without a university degree. He's a man who's not even spoken in public till that point in time.
He had a university degree actually, but only
not a doctorate, not what would have been seen as, today as research credentials and things like that. He did have a BA, yes, right? There is this very romantic, there is this kind of romance in this moment, where this person with no real background, right, no real credentials of any sort, takes the stage and moves an audience. It's something that speaks to all of us, I guess, because we are a country where credentials matter, background matters, who you're connected to matters, your network matters. In that sense, this is a moment that's a game changer of some kind. I think that's one thing that comes through from what you put together in the first section of your book. The second thing that is also inscribed into this moment is that of winning a public. Right? It's something that no one had really done. And Vivekananda, in some sense, set up the template. Right? If you are looking for where the Lagan moment of popular culture from 20 years ago comes from, it owes something to this moment of Vivekananda stepping up and saying something so compelling that people wanted to listen to him for the next 4 years in the United States, in the West. Right? The other thing that I find interesting about this moment is that it also has something very, very interesting. This is a man from a colonized country going to a country that has shaken off a colonizer and is getting used to being a culture in its own right. And so in one sense, there's a kind of innocence talking to innocence, right? In one sense, there's also two cultures, two entities recognizing each other in this moment. So many of these insights sort of start appearing naturally as one reads through your descriptions of Vivekananda's struggles to get there, right? When we read about this moment, we just read about it as he got a little public support, he went to Chicago, he spoke, and everything was a fairy tale after that. But the months of struggle that Vivekananda went through are very admirably pieced together in your book. I'd just like you to say a couple of things about this moment.
So, the skepticism that Arul talks about, it has actually become, if you look at books written on Vivekananda, very recently, I think it has been doubted, and I do mention a couple of articles in my book. One, whether Vivekananda actually said these words, brothers and sisters of America. The second one, whether people actually did this. The audience was supposedly a size of 6,000, and whether they actually just got up to his feet and applauded because he spoke 4 words. It just sounds something from out of this life, right? And there's also this image that seems a bit too convenient. Very confident Indian monk, Hindu monk, going up to the world of one of the greatest powers in the world, addressing the best minds there and winning them over, taming them, as it were. So there are a few aspects to it. What I found most interesting is that the image of a confident Vivekananda masterfully addressing the conference is not quite the true picture, which we get from Vivekananda's own letters to his correspondence. he wrote a letter right the day after or 2 days after his first speech at the conference. And he describes that moment as, he says, I was in a grand hall and 6,000 of the best civilized men and women of the land in front of you, and so many dignitaries around you. So the World Parliament of Religions was held to as part of the Columbian Exposition, which was a celebration of 400 years of Columbus' discovery of America. And it was something that is now forgotten, but if you look at cultural history, it's a very important moment because it's a very important event for that time. And the World's Parliament of Religion was one part of this entire exhibition. So there were all kinds of learned Jesuit priests, representatives of Buddhism, of Shintoism from Japan, Confucianism from China. So all these scholars are sitting with him. And he says, he realized that everyone had prepared speeches, and interestingly, Annie Besant, one of the founders of the Theosophical Society, was also a delegate and was on the stage with him. And he says, I, like a fool, had not bought any prepared speech. And then he describes how nervous he was. And every time the moderator, he would call, indicate to Vivekananda, you can come and talk, he kept putting it off. And I think from the morning till the almost late noon, he kept pushing this. And finally, at one moment, he felt he had to go for it. And he says, praying to Saraswati, I went up, I uttered these words, and suddenly there was a standing ovation that lasted for 3 or 4 minutes. And the next day, I knew my speech was the hit of the day, and I was famous across America. And so there are also other. Now the thing is, did this actually say brothers and sisters of America, and was this greeted with this kind of enthusiasm? So there are many accounts of people who witnessed that speech, and there's also the official account of the parliament, which the Speaker of the Parliament, a clergyman named Henry Barrows, brought out in 2 volumes, which contains a lot of the official proceedings, including the speeches that were delivered in the general session. Because there were also private sessions where people spoke. For example, Vivekananda spoke before a committee on science. He spoke about Islam there. We have no record of the speech because we have only records of what he said in the general session. So in that particular book, in volume 1, you find Vivekananda's speech, and he is quoted as opening it with Brothers and Sisters of America. And there are other accounts, including a very interesting account from a middle-aged lady called S.K. Blodgett, who writes that she was there when this young man from India got up to speak. And she says that this is in her memoir, published memoir, the first words out of his mouth, people stood up applauding, cheering, they knew not what. So it's not clear what exactly was it. Was it because he addresses them as brothers and sisters of America? Was it that welcoming thing? Was it his exotic look with the turban and this, or was it something else? Some moment of magnetism? We don't know. But as she goes on to say, and then after that, after the speech is over, you saw ladies were rushing to meet him, and she says, "Young man, if you can resist that, you're indeed a god." And so the story certainly seemed to be well attested. The size of the audience have been questioned. That's also, you will find it in not only in various newspaper accounts, and also there are newspaper accounts also of his speech. both that's the words he started, and there is movement that you talk about, that movement of what he called Waterman's idea of a dialectic. And it's also true that Vivekananda, was very nervous when delivering the speech, which is completely at odds with the image that we have constructed for ourselves.
Thank you. I think it's a moment that also worth placing next to an earlier moment from history that people in my profession tend to refer to a lot, which is Macaulay's famous minute, right? Which said that English education was necessary and would produce a race of servile brown Englishmen and so on. It's interesting to see Vivekananda appending those priorities in this moment, because what you see him do is take charge of the narrative and talk about something that nobody had spoken of before, right? At least not from this part of the world to the West. Do you want to comment on the strange congruencies that we see in Vivekananda's life, right? He's a man who embraces the Western world and also comes back to Vedanta, comes back to Indian ascetic traditions.
Yeah, I could try, but if you don't mind, I think maybe one way to convey a sense of how different Vivekananda is from the image, as a thinker, from the image we have of him, is perhaps I could read out a few of the things he has said, which a lot of people I know who have not necessarily read the book but read some extracts came to me and said, this is a completely different kind of person from whom we thought Vivekananda was. So this is a quote in regard to Islam. Vivekananda held Islam with respect, with great respect, in fact. And he says, my experience is that if ever any religion approached to equality in any appreciable manner, it is Islam and Islam alone. And in a speech in India to a public audience, a very large one, just held in an open field, he says, even to the Mohammedan rule, we owe that great blessing, the destruction of exclusive privilege. He's talking about caste privilege here. So his view, where he expresses a couple of other places, was that most of the conversions to Islam were not forced, but were natural. He says that it would be a madness to think that it was all the work of sword and fire. He said people converted to escape social oppression, that is lower caste. A lot of the converts were from lower caste who wanted to go into a more egalitarian social setup where they would not be oppressed, face caste oppression, and would have the opportunities that would otherwise be denied to them. Vivekananda is also a non-vegetarian. And he interestingly told many Hindus in many places that you should eat meat because it gives you strength and energy. Those are in keeping in line with 19th century scientific ideas of the effect of eating meat. And he was a great cook and enjoyed cooking. It was a great hobby with him. And one of his favorite dishes was a spicy mutton curry, which he used to serve all his Western friends and disciples. Just too spicy, too hot for them to stomach, but apparently that did not dissuade him from eating it again and again. So in reference to the question of meat eating, he says, the country has been flooded with dyspeptic Babajis living on vegetables only. This is comment on the condition of India, and even like 130 years after when I read this, a few people come to my mind. The other interesting thing is that Vivekananda did not blame the foreign conquest for the decline of Indian civilization. He felt there was a national decline, obviously, but he didn't think the British conquerors and the Islamic conquerors were merely external factors acting on an internal rot within. So, who did he blame for India's decline? He blamed the Brahmins and Kshatriyas and the social oppression that they had carried out through millennia. So, in commenting about the political slavery that the upper castes were now under because of the British rule and earlier because of Islamic rule, he says, the mass of Brahmin and Kshatriya tyranny has recoiled upon their own heads with compound interest. And 1,000 years of slavery and degradation is what the inexorable law of karma is visiting upon them. And in another place, our aristocratic ancestors went on treading the common masses underfoot till they became helpless. Till under this torment, the poor people nearly forgot that they were human beings. They have been compelled to be merely hewers of wood and growers of water for centuries. And this is one of his comments about women, the place of. It's very difficult to understand why in this country so much difference is made between men and women, whereas the Vedanta declares that one and the same self is present in all beings. Binding them by hard rules, the men have turned the women into mere manufacturing machines. There's another quotation. So long as man thinks that he has to cower before a supernatural being, so long there will be priests to claim rights and privileges and to make men cower before them, while these poor men will continue to ask some priest to act as interceder. Priestcraft and tyranny go hand in hand. Just to give a context, he is not objecting to the idea of God, but to the idea of God as a big daddy in the sky who will, punish you. So his notion of God was not anthropomorphic. I'll leave with one more quote. At a discussion in America, at Boston actually, he says in other places also, one peculiarity of the Vedas is that they are the only scriptures that again and again declare that you must go beyond them. The Vedas say that they were written just for the child mind, and when you have grown, you must go beyond them. Again here, Vivekananda is not dissing the Vedas. He's not saying that the Vedas are superstition and primitive because they talk about God and that intellectual progress is when you become an agnostic or atheist. That's not the sense in which he means it. What he means is that any scripture, be it the Vedas or any other scripture, is not to be taken as a normative authority that lays down fixed truths and rules. For the searcher after spiritual truth and knowledge, scriptures are the only point the way. They orient you in a certain direction, and the journey is something that you have to undergo personally. So regarding your question of the various inconsistencies that are there, yes, in fact, one could think of Vivekananda as somebody who is a synthesis of extremely opposite things, very powerful forces that clash within him. Sometimes you see them spill over, but the West is interestingly, Vivekananda was first and foremost a product of Western education. As far as intellectual this was concerned, spiritually he was completely Indian. But where Macaulay and his famous minute, where he miscalculated, is that Western education, the superiority of the Western thought is something that Macaulay also said that there is more truth and wisdom to be found in one English book than in a whole library of what these Asians have written. The really ironic thing here is that most of what was treasured in what we can say the last 500 years since the Renaissance in European letters were usually the work of people who were not at all like Macaulay. They were not part of the system, they were not part of the establishment. All of them were anti-establishment in some way or the other. And where he also miscalculated is that it was the work of these men that he was introducing young Indians to, like the philosopher Locke. John Locke wrote on political liberty and individual liberty, and he was one philosopher who had a lot of influence on Vivekananda's own ideas of political liberty and human liberty. And a set of thinkers, Hume, which caused skepticism among religious believers, and other thinkers of the Enlightenment. So a class of English-educated youth will come up who question not only the received wisdom of their country, but also that of the British establishment. So Vivekananda read both British and German philosophers, Hegel, Kant, and again there is something very incongruous about Vivekananda and Ramakrishna's relationship, because of the many mystics that you see, Ramakrishna was one of the most unlearned. He could hardly write his name in Bengali script, he did not read. And Vivekananda falls into he casts a spell over Vivekananda, who is acknowledged by his peers as well as his teachers as having an extraordinarily brilliant mind. He was trained in all the modern philosophy of the West. And he fights with Ramakrishna. He doesn't, so it's again a relationship that is very non-traditional. The Guru Shishya Bandha, or in Islamic mysticism, it is a per-marriage relationship. And in any form of, any mystical tradition, there's usually an initiation ritual where the student, the acolyte, would give unconditional obedience to the master who will train him. Vivekananda, on the other hand, his first impression of Ramakrishna was that this person is mad. But he sticks around and he realizes that he has wisdom, but he would not accept anything that his reason did not find logical. So he says that, Vivekananda says that for almost 5 years he fought Ramakrishna, saying that Kali did not exist. So he couldn't accept the idea of a personal God because he believed only in the impersonal God. And in the Indian tradition, Hindu tradition, it would be the Brahman, which is an impersonal, absolute reality beyond space, time, and causation. But he finally comes to accept Kali in the sense of a form of the divine, a particular way to conceive and communicate with the divine. And after he does that, and Ramakrishna passes away, Vivekananda completely goes into Indian traditions. When Ramakrishna dies, Vivekananda had very little idea of when he learned Sanskrit and also Urdu, as a matter of fact, but he had not read many scriptures. But he goes on to become a master of Sanskrit. He reads the scriptures and he is deeply knowledgeable about them. And when he resurfaces in America, he is also returning to the Western intellectual template, because what he does is to take this philosophy, Indian philosophy and the spiritual tradition, and put it into terms of late 19th century or mid 19th century European philosophy. So there is that circle there, and perhaps that's this going away, the starting, going away, and return. You can find how these incongruencies were kind of synthesized in his person.
It's a very fascinating account of this intellectual and spiritual journey that Vivekananda has made. One of the points that emerges very strongly in your book is this idea of Vivekananda being someone who values the audacity of reinterpretation, of revisiting the texts, of reading them carefully, of engaging and arguing with them, and so on. And I'd like, would you like to read a section from your book to illustrate this idea?
I'm not quite sure that I actually spend much time on his engagement with scripture because it would have been very technical. But his attitude of questioning, I think it's an almost of irreverence, you could say, to some things. Is very finely illustrated in this conversation he had with the Gorakshak. So this is in 1897 when Vivekananda returns from America after his success there, and he's greeted as a hero on coming. And he reaches Calcutta, and there, after the fanfare is just getting over, he gets time to meet people. And one of the people who visits him is a member of a cow protection society, many of which were coming up in North India at that time and some in Bengal also. So one of Vivekananda's disciples was present there, someone named Sharat Chandra Chakravarti, and he took down that conversation. So the extract I'm going to read starts with Chakravarti's account. At the announcement of this preacher of cow protection, Swamiji came out to the parlor room. The preacher saluted Swamiji and presented him with a picture of the mother cow. Vivekananda, what is the object of society? Gorakshak, we protect the mother cows of our country from the hands of the butcher. Cow infirmaries have been founded in some places where the deceased decrepit mother cows or those bought from the butchers are provided for. Vivekananda, that is very good indeed. What is the source of your income? Gorakshak, the work of the society is carried on only by gifts kindly made by great men like you. Vivekananda, a terrible famine has now broken out in central India. The Indian government has published a death roll of 9 lakhs of starved people. Has your society done anything to render help in this time of famine? Gorakshak, we do not help during famine or other diseases. This society has been established only for the protection of mother cows. The preacher was unmoved by Vivekananda's exhortation that it was his duty to help his fellow brothers and sisters who were facing death. The Gorakshak replied, apparently without any sense of irony, that the famine-stricken people were suffering because of their past karma and nothing could be done for them. The reply apparently infuriated Vivekananda, who told the Gorakshak bluntly that he had no sympathy to spare for societies which would not lift a finger to help human beings, but wasted piles of food on birds and bees. Vivekananda further countered that if one were to appeal to the principle of karma, then the cows were falling into the butcher's hand because of their own karma, and it was useless to do anything for them too. This retort flummoxed the preacher. Yes, what you say is true, but the Shastras say that the cow is our mother. Vivekananda's reply sums up his thoughts. Yes, that the cow is our mother, I understand. Who else could give birth to such accomplished children?
I think what we've established is the kind of thinker that Vivekananda was. What he seems to teach is a kind of fearlessness in thinking about the past, in approaching tradition. How then do you explain the manner in which this figure has been co-opted by a certain political ideology?
This is something I discuss briefly in my book. I don't remember which chapter. And it is perhaps worthy of a sociological study. But one of the reasons that has, so the question is, what is there in Vivekananda that allows for appropriation? So there is first the fact that Vivekananda spoke perhaps very highly of Hinduism. He was a gifted orator, and in his flights of eloquence, he took his exposition of the inherent spiritual worth of Hinduism to great heights. And he in the West, he declared this, not as the spiritual superiority of India several times. So this is one area in which there is an easy link within that kind of narrative. But one thing one has to understand is that Vivekananda was speaking in a very different context. He was speaking in a colonial context. Now, as you talked about the encounter between the innocence of a democratic America, who was thrown off the colonizers, encountering someone who is colonized by Britain. There is that similarity, and I think this sense of freedom that he felt in America was something that made him call America a nation with a great future. But there's also, despite this fact, a dissimilarity, because America, and also he also spoke in England quite a number of times. So his audience were either Americans or Englishmen. So Americans too were culturally and economically invested in the project of British imperialism. So this period, the second half of the 19th century, has been compared to the process of globalization that we are witnessing now. The difference being that what linked various countries together was not trade alone, but their political occupation by Britain and other European countries. But most of the colonies were held by Britain, and Anglo-American culture and Protestant Christianity both permeated the currents that flow into these countries, the thought currents and institutions. And the self-identity of a lot of Americans came from the fact that they were Protestant Christians, and they saw Christianity as a rational religion. So there's also a lot of superstitions stereotypes about Hinduism, which had its roots in missionary propaganda, but which a good number of Americans believed. Like, for example, one of the questions that Vivekananda was asked the most when he spoke there was, why do Hindu mothers throw their children, their babies, newborn babies, to the crocodiles in the Ganges? So how does one respond to a question like that? It's like if someone comes from, say, South Africa, and we were to ask him, how do you deal with the headhunters there? So once Vivekananda replied that, yes, madam, I too was thrown into the crocodiles when I was a baby, but as a fat baby, and they couldn't chew me properly, so I was spat back. So it is in this context, Vivekananda was combative, and he wouldn't be content to be an apologizer defending his race and his religion. He went on the attack, and he would say, yes, you might have all the material prosperity in the world, but your children, you have a civilization of about 500 years. We have seen 2,000 years of civilization. And you might have great material power, but the Hindu knows that the true wealth lies in spirituality. All this is going to end before a blink of the eye. And if you don't seek the eternal, you're just children. So it is in this context that he makes these claims. Otherwise, whenever he talked to other religions, he did not only from a point of acceptance, but of equality. He said that every religion is true. Every religion is the incarnation of the universal religion. So this is the only basis that the Sant Parivar has for appropriating Vivekananda. But why has and so one crucial moment in this is that while Vivekananda is claimed as the icon of the Hindu right, as a historical fact, if you look at the founding fathers of the Hindutva movement, Savarkar, Hedgawar, and Golwalkar, they were not really influenced by Vivekananda. I mean, you find some mentions of Vivekananda in Golwalkar's Bunch of Thoughts, but one doesn't. I mean, they don't draw their inspiration from him or his ideas. The RSS came to Vivekananda much later, in the 60s. And this was a time when RSS was a political pariah in a lot of ways because of, after they had been banned after the assassination of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. And they found a cause. Now, I'm not saying that this is wrong for them to do anything. I think it was a worthy cause of erecting a statue of Vivekananda at Kanyakumari, where he had sat in meditation for 3 days, one about the future of India. Unfortunately, the Tamil Nadu government then was not too keen on the plan, and the RSS had to raise public opinion in favor of Vivekananda, and Vivekananda was not forgotten, and people responded. They felt that, yes, he is a national icon and is a place associated with him, so there should be a statue for him there. But this also allowed the Sangh Parivar to associate the image of Vivekananda with their own. I mean, this is the fact that he wore an ochre robe, and that that is the same color, right? So it's an association of images rather than of thought. But perhaps why has it succeeded so well is because I think there is Vivekananda is not really taken seriously as a thinker anymore. And it is the past 30, 40 years, the people who read Vivekananda's text critically, produce biographies of him, produce readings of his thought, popularize it, have been missing. There's a critical vacuum around his text. So everyone, either they criticize him or from every, the whole political spectrum, every point, people otherwise pay homage to him, is an empty adulation at an image. And then it's easy to hijack for anyone who wants to try and do that. So I think this is what has led to that appropriation.
The other point that you make very well in the book is that this appropriation of Vivekananda's legacy has been accompanied by a kind of craven surrender, right? By a kind of uncritical misreading of his works by the people who could perhaps contest it, right? And that, as you're pointing out, it may come from an inability to engage with the modes of writing that he preferred. In your book, you talk about how the idea of comparative religious studies is something that is losing steam in India, and perhaps that's one place from where a rereading of Vivekananda could come from. And I guess another place where it could come from is from contemporary history, if people visited Vivekananda's speeches and letters more carefully. Right. All right. The other thing that I find emerging very strongly from your book is the sense of Vivekananda as someone committed to a sort of individualism, right? Seeing an individualistic sort of path to spirituality and to the practice of citizenship. Right? And I find that very fascinating because after reading your book, I was seized by a little curiosity about his brothers and about what happened to his descendants.
That's a very interesting story.
Right? And I found out about the two brothers who survived to adulthood. There was this brother named Mahendranath and this other brother named Bhupendranath. One became a revolutionary and then went and studied anthropology, was about to be arrested for his...
In fact, was
arrested. Was about to be, and Sister Nivedita helped him go to the US and study anthropology and so on.
It was basically political exile. She warned him in time that he was going to be arrested and he had to flee.
And there's the older brother who also set off and became a traveler across Europe and Africa and then came
on foot.
Right? So it seems to be a very interesting, eccentric kind of individualism that seems to have come from the family upbringing that they had, where it was a family open to conversations and open to this idea of young boys challenging adults in the home and things like that. I'm just a little curious about what else you've been able to figure about this very strongly individualistic streak in Vivekananda's character.
So it is a streak in his character that makes itself visible in various stages of his career and life. And I think the boldness that is associated with Vivekananda, because he said things very categorically in very bold language, and which has been, I think, perverted into an idea of a masculine, Vivekananda of power and authority. But what allowed for his boldness was his independence as a thinker and as a person. So he's, in fact, in one way, so for example, he tried to convince Sri Ramakrishna that all his visions of goddess and talking to her and all this were just hallucinations of his mind. He said, but I see her and she talks to me, and he say, Western science have proved that the brain can cause hallucinations. So it's not only that he disagrees with his guru, but is actually trying to convert his guru to his path of thinking. And so we have so many instances of this. But what I find truly fascinating, and I think this is very an unexplored part of his philosophy, is that this individualism plays a role in his exposition of the Vedanta. So for those of whom may not be familiar with this, Vedanta is one of the 6 schools of traditional Indian philosophy. But the other 5 schools have died out pretty much. So that contemporary Hinduism, insofar as its philosophical commitment goes, is only Vedantic. And Vedanta has 3 schools, and one of them is the most celebrated one, is the Advaita of Shankara. So the Advaita basically says the world is Maya and what is real is Brahman, which is something that one can only speak of negatively. And you can say it is not this, it's not this. You can negate, you can away, but you can't grasp it through the mind, through concepts, or through language. So there is an ultimate, so this famous statement from the Upanishad, Tattvamasi, which means thou art that, or Aham Brahmasmi, which means I am Brahman, it declares that your ultimate real self is identical to Brahman or God. Now, Vivekananda talked much more, so in traditional discussion, it is Brahman that is important. But Vivekananda talked a lot about the Atman, the self of man. So his exposition of Advaita has his locus in the soul of man. His central message is that man is real. You don't know your real nature. You're identified with this finite complex of body and mental phenomenon, but what you are is infinite consciousness. And he makes the individual the site of divine reality and truth. And in a way, it is also a response, a natural response to the intellectual crisis of modernity. In that, with because modernity, by which we mean the whole intellectual movement that starts with the Renaissance in the 1500s and goes on, particularly manifested in the 19th century. The individual becomes the locus of political, civic, and social being, and traditional structures of, whether it's monarchy or organized religion, they become diluted. And this becomes a greater crisis as you go on in the 20th century. The individual is suddenly forced to reckon with her solitary existence in the world. So, one way Vivekananda incorporated that individual-centric ethos of modernity. And this, I think one of the reasons he says that Advaita is the religion of the future. But by Advaita, he is not talking about the particular exposition in the Hindu religion. He is talking about all kinds of spiritual monisms that exist in almost every spiritual tradition, like Sufism in Islam, or the Rhineland mystics who said similar things in Christianity, and so forth.
My last question today is about the focus you place on Vivekananda's changing attitudes to caste and gender in the last section of your book. Can you share with the audience in a crystallized form?
This is a really complex question because my last chapter of the book is on caste, and I think it takes some 60 pages. So if you don't mind, just for the sake of brevity, I leave out the gender question because I think his views there are far more straightforward to understand. But so Vivekananda's had a huge influence on anti-caste movements because he was a Hindu sannyasi coming and saying, and he had become a national icon then. When he came to Madras, he embarked in the south near Ramnad, which Ramnad was a princely state of that time. And the Raja himself drew the carriage that carried Vivekananda, and he made a series of speeches in Madurai, Rameshwaram, many places, and in Madras. Madras, the crowd was so huge that he could not speak the first day. And he had to stand on top of a carriage, which he called Gita style, and speak to the audience, basically tell them, thanks for coming, go away, come again next day. And he gives a speech the next day. So constantly he attacked caste privilege. He says that no caste can claim any privilege over others. And this was a wonderfully refreshing message for many non-Brahmin, non-Kshatriya castes. And he had a very direct influence on the anti-caste movement of Iravas, which starts around that time and goes on till the 1940s. And he met both, so the movement was headed by Sri Narayana Guru, who also, like Vivekananda, was a Vedantist. And he preached against caste. He also met Dr. Palpu, who was another major figure. And he influenced Kumaranashan, who the third biggest mover in that movement. And the magazine, so they had created the SNDP, which was their front to fight against caste and the right of the Iravas. And they had a magazine, a weekly magazine, and Kumaranashan was the editor, named it Vivekodaya, Interview to Vivekananda. So, and he intervenes on behalf of some Iravas for their rights in the British Parliament and all that. So this is a reason that Vivekananda has been traditionally read as being an anti-caste reformer. But recently that has come in for both for academic criticism, and a lot of it is centered around quotes where he says caste is good. Caste is a plan that we want to follow, and I'm not an abolisher of caste. The second one, he praises Brahmanhood. So what is happening here, and really this might sound egregious, but if you just look at the places where he talks about them and read the entire text, it's very clear that he is not using these words in their normal sense of the term. So I think what Vivekananda is living at almost the end of the Bengal Renaissance. And in the beginning, while the social reforms carried out by Ram Mohan Roy and Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar and dozens of figures like that were very effective. Vivekananda felt that in his own generation, where there was an interesting split happening, the Calcutta Bhadralok, the Bengal Bhadralok, and were demanding a greater place in government, in British administration, and the British had no intention of giving it to them. So they culturally put them down as effete, as the Bengali Babu who is always trying to make a few more bucks and get a peon's job kind of thing. And in this kind of narrative, Vivekananda, what happens is that many people oppose the government. So up to that point, the British government was a friend. Most of the reformers of the Bengal Renaissance were pro-British because they saw British as carrying out enlightened reforms like the abolishment of sati and the restriction of child marriage and all that. But now there is a divergence of interest. The Indian elite are developing nationalistic aspirations, and they no longer align with those of the colonizer. And as these people step away from their close allies with the British, the space is created for people of perhaps slightly lesser ability, maybe of slightly better social rank, to come into that space. And I would not use words like collaborate or competitor or anything of that sort. These people were perhaps less concerned with notions of nation building and so forth, and there was a tendency to blindly follow the British, to aid their ways, because it's an incentive, right? I mean, you're working for them, your fortunes depend on them, so parroting what they say is useful. So Vivekananda felt that the criticism of caste has become not only artificial, but also destructive, in that you're always being angry, spewing anger at those scriptures, and at that time there was no differentiation between the various kind of scriptures, so attacking them. And also artificial because this was only a small elite, most of them Brahmins, and these attacks had no connection with the masses. Vivekananda, on the other hand, traveled for 5 years to the length and breadth of India. He interacted with the people, and this is something that he didn't see the modern reforming intellectual do. He was deracinated completely. He's talking about caste, the annihilation of caste, but he has no contact with even the middle classes, caste, let alone lower caste or the Dalits. Well, Vivekananda traveled and stayed at the home of untouchable castes of that time and interacted with them. So he thought it was better to work from within the tradition, that instead of telling Hindus that you have to change your religion, which is always a difficult proposition for the religiously minded, it was more useful to tell them that, you don't need to change your religion, you only need to understand it better. So he takes the word jati, and it takes its etymology to species. And he says species means individuality. Now this he takes from the Nyaya school of logic. And parallelly, even Narayana Guru does this. He writes a poem called Jati Nirnayam. So at that time in Kerala, you could present philosophical treatises through poetry. And he argues that the meaning is species, and from which he concludes that Jati means universality. Vivekananda, I think, innovates further, and I think it is probably quite tactical on his part, that species means particularity, so Jati means individuality. So to truly follow a Jati system, he says the problem is that you have not been following the caste system correctly. To truly follow the Jati system is to give the full play of individuality to everybody. So this is a proposition that is more radical than even in matters of caste. He's telling them that to follow the scriptures and the idea of Jati, you have to give complete individuality and freedom of action to every individual in all areas of their being. And it's quite clear. He says when caste rose in Europe, and had full sway, Europe became powerful. And obviously, that makes no sense if you take caste to be either caste in the Indian sense or caste in as class, as is the word is used in the West. So he's obviously referring. So he's turning it around on his head, but with hindsight, we can say this would never have worked. But again, that's historical hindsight. At that time, I don't think one could have imagined in the 1890s where things looked that in just 1905, the Swadeshi movement will start, the partition of Bengal would happen, and by the 1920s, you'll have a mass civil disobedience movement throughout the country. And all these things are created which did not exist before, and which completely changed the nature of the country, the force, the balance of forces. I think if Vivekananda had lived to see that, he might have attacked caste more directly than in an indirect fashion.
Thank you for that response. It brings out the fascinating layers and ramifications of Vivekananda's thought. We'll now open the floor for questions. We'll follow a simple procedure. There's a mic here. Please come up, introduce yourself, and ask your question. Govind will be happy to respond to questions that come from the audience.
I have a question, rather a point to make. Today, the dispensation which is ruling India are proposing a very dangerous idea that the fall of India is due to invasion of foreigners, especially Muslim rule, and that being the proposition, communal divide is being encouraged, and it portends a very dangerous trend in the country. But if you study Vivekananda, he is very clear. It is not Mohammedan invasion or any other invasion which is responsible for the fall of India. It is the Indians themselves. It is the wrong and tyrannical caste system which destroyed the society even before the Mohammedans came. And instead of blaming others, he asks us to do self-introspection and do self-reform. I would like the speaker to say something more about this, what Vivekananda exactly is, his opinion on this.
So Vivekananda many times says this in so many words. Don't blame others. Don't throw mud at others. For your fall, you yourself are responsible. And he did hold the caste system. And he talks about social oppression. So it's not only the caste system, but the whole body of rules. So in fact, Vivekananda's biggest opponents in India were two different groups. One were Christian missionaries who attacked him. The other were Orthodox Hindus, mainly Orthodox Brahmins, who did not like what he was preaching. And there are many temples at which he was not allowed to enter because he had crossed the seas. So Vivekananda says that in one place he says that, as I think I read out, that the Mohammedan rule came as a blessing because a lot of people were able to move up in society, get out of the caste system. And so his view is the exact opposite of the idea that India, because of foreign invasions, has declined, has become, but rather even the British rule, he says, interestingly, he sometimes says it has come as a salvation of India. And he said, so he was very critical of the British political dominance and the economic drain of India. But so So, for example, one interview to given to I'm not sure an American or a British reporter, she asked Vivekananda to talk about politics. And Vivekananda, as a matter of principle, said, I will not talk about politics because that's not my own. I only want to talk about spiritual principles in which you can apply, moral principles you can apply to politics. And he says, well, to talk about politics, the least freeborn Negro in America has a higher political position than it is mine under the present government. But it is all right. It is India's own karma, and it's misunderstanding. We know very well that it is from the blood and fiber of England that India's salvation will come. Now, what did he mean by this? What he meant was that you had a society which was become very rigid, ossified superstitions. I mean, the amount of superstition then is completely unbelievable. And this superstition is not only about the caste oppression, it's about even those oppressors were bound. Like an upper caste Brahmin had to go through, I don't know how many dozen purificative rituals every day. He had to make sure that he could only eat food of a certain kind. So these rules that hemmed people in. So he saw that as a failure of India's spirit, and he attributes it to the fact that Indians stopped going out and visiting other nations. He says the day the word mlecha was invented, India's fate was sealed. Mlecha is a word that is used for someone who is either not a Hindu, but at that time particularly of a foreign race. So Vivekananda says that one of the reasons that the rule against crossing the seas came into effect was that the Hindu priests, the Orthodox, didn't want Indians to come into contact with Buddhism in other nations because it was a rival. It was a rival and a challenge, and they have just managed to get it out of India. So this intellectual insularity, this cultural insularity, which led to the caste system, which was more flexible in earlier days, in the sense that you have Shudra kings, Shudra dynasties ruling India. But later, in the Middle Ages, you need to become a king, you needed to be a Kshatriya. So a lot of Shudra or Vaishya dynasties just had Brahmins fabricate genealogies from, the Rajputs and so forth. The Rajputs themselves did that. So he says that, and about the Muslim conquest in particular. So Vivekananda was fascinated by history, and he was particularly fascinated by the Mughals. So we have accounts from Sister Nivedita and other disciples about his almost obsession with the Mughals. So he would, Nivedita's word, the Mughals had cast a spell over Vivekananda. Vivekananda visited dargahs, tombs, palaces of the Mughals and various other Muslim ruling dynasties. He was fascinated by their architecture. He spent quite a time in the Taj Mahal, and he said that every square inch of this place is worth a week's study. And he said about Shah Jahan that he was one of the greatest artists who ever lived because he had seen a piece of calligraphy written by Shah Jahan's own hand. And his disciples would say that when he talked about the Mughals, we felt him bring the past to life so much that we felt he was telling the story of his own previous life. And he particularly admired Akbar. Ashoka and Akbar were for him the two greatest monarchs who had ruled India. Neither of them were Hindu. And perhaps he estimated Akbar even beyond Ashoka. In his esteem for Akbar was so high that he used to remark that in the Hindu tradition, the highest state is when you are ready for liberation or moksha. So then we are near to being a perfected being. That Akbar was someone who aspired for and almost reached the goal but missed it, and is born as a king instead. So his esteem, his fascination with the Islamic culture of India is polar opposite of this narrative that you are talking about. And also Vivekananda grew up, realized that there was a time when there was much more mingling between the religions in a lot of ways at the cultural sphere. And Vivekananda learned Urdu as a matter of, it is part of your heritage, Persian and Urdu and Sanskrit. Vivekananda's father was proficient in all these three, and he used to read the Bible, the Quran, and the Bhagavad Gita, like almost on a daily basis, according to accounts from his children.
Am I audible? Yeah, my name is Ambarish. Yeah, I had one question. Do you think that it was just convenient for RSS to appropriate Vivekananda because this is 1890s we are talking about, we have novels like Anand Math talk about the sannyasi rebellion coming in. And it was just convenient that Vivekananda being a celibate sannyasi, so that he became the perfect fit for RSS. And was that the reason, or there is something deeper? Because if we look at the RSS Sarsang Chalaks, all of them have all of them have been celibates,
Right.
at least in the public domain. My second question is about: do you think that organizations such as Ramakrishna Mission can actually rehabilitate Vivekananda and snatch him back from the RSS pantheon and maybe rehabilitate him back again? Is this a possibility, or it will be too much to ask for?
Very nice question. Very nice. Very important.
In response to the first, the RSS and the Sangh Parivar bases itself on the Hindu tradition to some extent. So, one thing that links them together is Vivekananda was perhaps the first Hindu monk to introduce the idea of, there's always been the idea of seva in the Hindu tradition, but it has been usually, though there are exceptions in antiquity also, been interpreted as serving God. But Vivekananda and Ramakrishna also reinterpreted this to mean service of man, because you see God in man. So that tradition, the tradition of seva is very much part of the RSS, and they do social work. So, and the celibacy is again a monastic requirement. There is the idea that you renounce everything for getting enlightenment, and they adapted the idea to a different level. You renounce everything for the betterment of society in the way you see it. And one has to be said that there is a lot of idealism in that. I think it's a mistake to see the RSS as as often as just this completely malign force. I mean, they could not have been successful if they were only that. And there is a good bit of idealism behind it, which I think attracts a lot of people. But in the forms that it has taken on now, it is, I think, quite frankly, the narrative is very dangerous. And regarding so these are the only similarities. There's no other deeper reason, as far as I'm examining Vivekananda's work, that the son would be able to appropriate him. As to your second question, particularly about the Ramakrishna Mission, I doubt if they can, merely because they don't, like, they have a style, they are always been apolitical, not as a principled stance saying we are renunciates. So during the independence movement, Nivedita had to leave Ramakrishna Mission. There's no acrimony as far as but she had to leave the Ramakrishna Mission because she wanted to take part in and support the freedom struggle. So even then they stayed apolitical. So they continue to do their work in that they continue to publish material on Vivekananda that looks at Vivekananda in only this light. But that is not the language of India's public sphere now. If Vivekananda is to be rehabilitated and his vision of Hinduism of India which is a completely inclusive universal distribution, is to be reintroduced. I think like it has to come from people who are usually thought of as either secular or apolitical, but who are part of the public sphere and speak that language. I think if at all it is possible, it has to come from that side.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for the very interesting talk. Particularly, I like the part on the last part on the caste, seeing, let's say, not from the Varna point of view, but from the Jati. Am I not? Okay. Not from the, let's say, Varna point of view, but from the Jati and the individualism that I never heard before. And also made me sad that you didn't want to comment about the gender, but probably you would have said something also very interesting. I don't know if you have a minute about it. So this might be a small question if you want, but my question was maybe more similar to what my predecessor asked. Let's say this appropriation that a certain majoritarian ideology is doing of Vivekananda makes me think also a little bit of what happened to Sri Aurobindo ideology, in particular what's happening in Auroville. And so are there any, at least for a foreigner, any similarities between the two philosophies of the two? And why do you think that their path is being appropriated in a similar way? Thank you.
The thing is, I am not familiar with Aurobindo's work, and I think Aurobindo is a thinker that you have to read yourself because he was highly original. Though Aurobindo was the basic template that almost every spiritual thinker who comes later uses is one that Vivekananda forged. So, but he builds on it. So I cannot really comment on, because I'm not familiar with what is happening in Auroville and what kind of appropriation is happening. But I would say that the Hindu right is trying to appropriate all the figures that they think they can appropriate. I mean, they're trying to appropriate Ambedkar. I mean, Ambedkar was the harshest critics of Hinduism ever. I mean, he found almost then nothing worthy in the religion of Hinduism. So Bhagat Singh was a communist. So I think perhaps this is just part of the fact that, and of course Aurobindo is, though his message is very universal, he is still he went there from within the Hindu tradition. So appropriation is easy. What is your question on gender? Like,
apparently, you say something about what Vivekananda thinks about gender in your book. I don't know.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, so Vivekananda was. So we look at Vivekananda in his before he goes to America. There's a letter he writes to a lady called Indumati, and this must be when he is 29, and he tells her that you must always remember that the prime duty of the wife is to serve the husband. So here he's thinking along traditional lines, and this is not particularly surprising because Vivekananda did not study in a co-education college. I don't think there were any in India at that time, and also, after that, he became an ascetic. So he was not coming into contact with women other than, of course, in his own household. But he always had great respect for individual women because his mother was someone he says was one of the figures who really inspired him. So he could see what women could do. But it's very interesting and a take on how quick a learner Vivekananda was, that just in a matter of 6 months, Vivekananda is in the US. He comes into contact with American women. And his view of what women are capable of is revolutionized. And he says, anything that a man can do, a woman can do, and usually better. And he gives examples whether it's in science, business, or even in warfare, whenever women have been given the opportunities, they have done better than men. And this is a more radical position than you would realize for someone in the 1890s, because we take the major thinkers of that age, including women who are present in women's rights movement. They has not come to that point. For a lot of them, for example, opposed the right of women to vote, while Vivekananda says, I see no reason why women should not get the right to vote. This was at least 20 years, 25 years before the suffragette movement. And the equality of men and women is also something that Vivekananda derives from, I think, as I said, he was influenced by John Locke and also John Stuart Mill, the British pragmatic philosopher. And John Stuart Mill wrote one of the earliest feminist tracts demanding equal rights for women. That would have been an early influence. But it also came from his philosophical conviction of Advaita, that the same self resides in every human being, and every human being is potentially divine and is trying to manifest that. So he says, is there any differentiation between at the level of the soul? It's just at the level of the body that we notice this difference. And he says, so other than a matter of mere biological strength, men and women are equal in all respects.
We have a question here.
Thank you. Do I need to go in front? I'm supposing that a comment is permissible, not necessarily a question. First of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
I thought the coverage was excellent and very beautifully brought out by Arul through his questions. I was particularly pleased because it resonated very well with a play that we put together exactly 10 years ago, the 150th birth anniversary year of Swami Vivekananda. And 10 years later, on his birthday this year, we presented at this very hall an abridged version of the same play. And I'd like you to meet Anusha there. Could you stand, please? She's one of the actors in the play and a very fine actress indeed.
Do you play Vivekananda? No, not the prime part, okay.
Well, let me just explain what I meant by resonance. The Ministry of Culture, the government of India, actually commissioned the play, and we were very nervous.
Right.
Because we felt that they would want the play to go in a certain direction.
Mm-hmm.
We explained that if we do the play, it will be as objective as we can make it. It will be non-hagiographic, not championing Hinduism. It will emphasize Vivekananda the man. He was a very fascinating personality. And his work, rather than the color saffron, surprisingly, the ministry permitted it.
Okay.
The ministry permitted it.
But this was in
2013. The previous government, yes.
The previous government, yes.
Much of what we covered, I mean, we had 6 months of research by a team of 6 people. Much of what we covered was so much of what you covered in your book. And now I am convinced that I should buy the book.
That's plus 10 happy news.
We'll just take one last question here and then we'll wrap it up.
Hi. So I just want to preface my question saying I'm an engineer. I'm not really trained in history or sociology or anything. So my question starts from here that over the last 1 or 2 years, I've been attending a lot of talks in literature fests, and there has been a rise in scholarship in like the conservative right-wing figures, like let's say Vikram Sampath's biography on Savarkar, Sanjeev Sanyal's
Right.
book on revolutionaries, or even Aurobindo Ghosh and everything.
Mhm.
So, do you think, and we know there's a weaponization of history that's going on, our textbooks are being changed, but in a sense, a counter question is that is this rise in scholarship because of first, either history as a profession itself is growing, or is it just appropriation of history by the current government or something like that, or is it because now there is a space for academics to get out of the sort of the circle jerk that was probably going on in the last 50 years? So where does this lie? Because we can see a rise in scholarship. Even probably your book is a like a proper work on Vivekananda, which we might not have seen previously. So where does all of this stand?
I think one thing is that it was not that earlier histories did not exist, but these were popular history as a genre is a very recent development in India. Most history books were written by academics, though many of them wrote very readable prose, but it was like only for the history enthusiasts who would, take up this, very factual, deeply research this. Now with the explosion of the publishing industry in India in English, there's a huge demand for history. This is being met by, so someone like Manipulay. I don't think we had an equivalent previously, like someone who is writing, and that is what he's writing about is not from any particular political person. You can say he's liberal, his assumptions are liberal. So I think that is the reason we see a rise in there's not really a rise in scholarship as the kind of scholarship. And secondly, I do think that the books that you mentioned are just part of legitimization process of trying to appropriate history and create a certain narrative. I think that is the main thrust behind it.
And with that, I thank our speakers, Dr. Arul Mani and Govind Krishnan, for being here today.